In this episode, we're going to talk about two composers. They could hardly be more different. To show you what I mean, we're going to hear what the Grove Dictionary of Music has to say about each one. Let's start with our first composer. About this guy, the Grove is pretty sour. His music is monotonous in texture, which consists in essence mainly of artificial and gushing tunes. Sounds pretty bad. The second composer is a much different story. One of the last great representatives of Romanticism in Russian classical music. Pronounced lyricism, expressive breadth, structural ingenuity, and a tonal palette of rich, distinctive orchestral colors. The name of our first composer? Sergei Rachmaninoff. And the name of our second composer is Sergei Rachmaninoff. The only difference is that the first quote comes from the Grove Dictionary of 1954, but the second one was from the edition in 2001. The world around him changed quite a lot in the 47 years between those two editions. By the time Rachmaninoff died in 1943, the reigning musical trend was modernism, and the most celebrated composers were complex and dissonant. To the modernists and their cheerleaders, including the gentleman who wrote for the Grove, clearly, Rachmaninoff was embarrassing, a throwback to the previous century, nostalgic and grandly melodic in a way that music just wasn't supposed to be anymore. He was a fish out of water. No one felt that more acutely than Rachmaninoff himself. He said in 1939, "I feel like a ghost in a world grown alien. I cannot cast out the old way of writing, and I cannot acquire the new." Rachmaninoff's world at that point was already alien. He was in exile. He had left his beloved Russia with the rise of the Bolshevik Revolution and came to the US, where he lived in New York, then in Los Angeles. And his music was soon banned in the Soviet Union. So he already felt out of place, but even more devastating to him was feeling out of time, told that he did not belong in the musical era that the world had come to. Rachmaninoff wrote, sadly, "I have made intense effort to feel the musical manner of today, but it will not come to me." His third symphony was written between 1935 and 1936, and I would say that it can be seen as part of the intense effort that he's talking about. The piece's orchestration and musical gestures are vintage Rachmaninoff, but this time there's an anxious, disjointed feeling to the piece. It's a much shorter piece than his other symphonies. It's almost half the length of his previous one, as though he wants to disprove the critics who called his music self-indulgent. The luxurious climaxes of his earlier works, think about the Second Piano Concerto and others, just don't arrive on cue in this one. The symphony begins with a somber theme, which sounds like it might come out of the Orthodox Russian church liturgy, to which Rachmaninoff was always deeply connected. We hear it as though from afar, like an echo, played by muted horns, cellos, and clarinets. Now, this theme comes back in different forms in all three of the symphony's movements. What does it mean? Is it a persistent thought or memory? Some kind of fate, perhaps, that the symphony and composer cannot escape? We might have a clue in another theme, which occurs towards the end of the piece. It's an adaptation of one of Rachmaninoff's favorite musical thoughts, the Dies Irae motif from church plainchant. This is the music of the Day of Judgment, warning that all things come to an end. And in 1936, the world was indeed on its way to an apocalypse, still reeling from the Great Depression and lurching into World War II, while back in his native Russia, the dictator Joseph Stalin unleashed ever greater horrors. This was a different world than the one in which Rachmaninoff wrote his rhapsodic earlier pieces, and its very different music. Critics and audiences didn't quite know what to make of this piece when it premiered in 1936. The people who thought Rachmaninoff was too old-fashioned still did. Others thought exactly the opposite, that he'd lost his voice by trying too hard to be modern. Rachmaninoff himself thought the piece worked well, and that it expressed his state of mind. Heard today, it's lush and complex, and I would say it mirrors the anxiety of the times. Perhaps the problem with this piece was that for once, Rachmaninoff was not out of step, but exactly of the moment.